what I enjoy about both of these individuals is they're both men who have opinions and convictions, but both hold them loosely enough that they engage in conversations very easily and readily with other people about important issues. So I think you're in for a great night. And so let me ask each of you to do a brief introduction, and then who would like to start? Did you all decide? Wendell, you want to start? Okay, that's great.
Well, good evening. It's good to be back. So to answer Tom's question, I do a lot of budget work with Leader Nancy Pelosi, but actually I learned more about these two things. I'll say two other things about my background. In 1990, I was involved with someone named Dan Rostenkowski for 11 days at Andrews Air Force Base. And the goal was to reduce the federal budget deficit by $500 billion. And George Bush had said, he had made the promise, read my lips, no new taxes. But he broke that promise. And I think he did the country a lot of good, because that budget deficit agreement, I think, had a lot to do with the economic growth that happened at the end of the 1990s. And my job for Dan Rostenkowski was working closely with the Congressional Budget Office, and the goal of our exercise was to make sure that the pain of deficit reduction, and when I say pain, what are you doing? You're raising someone's taxes or taking away someone's benefit or service. So there's no, and the goal is, to restore the budget balance, and that ultimately leads to economic growth, but there's upfront pain followed maybe later on by greater economic growth. So that's one thing that kind of informs a little bit of this discussion tonight. And then secondly, I left the Ways and Means Committee and went into the Clinton administration to do welfare reform. And Bill Clinton appropriately signed the Welfare Reform Act in 1996, but I resigned because I had done analysis that suggested it would put 1 million children into poverty, and I couldn't justify it to my peers. So those are two things that about economic policy. So I want to begin this evening by a thought experiment, because we're going to be talking about income inequality and economic growth, and there's not necessarily right or wrong answers. And the thought experiment I want you to engage with me kind of comes from John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, A Veil of Ignorance. Pretend you're about to be reborn, one of the 4 million babies born in this country each year. Now, not reborn in the spiritual sense, but
we do that too.
With your adult knowledge. But you don't know whether you're going to be born male, female, black, white, or Hispanic. You don't know whether you're going to have an IQ of 120 or 90. You don't know whether your parents are going to be good role models. You don't know whether you're going to be born in Southeast Washington, D.C., or in Great Falls. It's whatever those probabilities are in the United States. Then the question I want to pose throughout this evening is, what kind of a system or society do you want to be born into so that you can achieve all of your God-given abilities? So that's the background. Now, now I'm going to go through a few numbers. So we get our data from various places, from IRS, from the Census Bureau, and something else. So this comes from Emmanuel Saez and Tom Piketty of the French economists. So this looks at the total economic pie and looks at how much is going to the top 1% and the top 1/2 of 1%. And it's a long series of charts, and they have to do some work because we don't always, the rules for filing income tax, and they have to do some manipulation here. But I think everybody kind of believes that series. So the top 1% today gets a little over 20% of the economic pie. And that, you notice, if you go from about the 1950 to 1980, that top 1% share stayed pretty level at around 10, and now it's taken off. So here's another way. This looks at the CEOs of the top 350 firms ranked by sales. And in 1970s, the 1960s, the CEO on average of these 350 firms made about 20 times the typical worker. Then in the 1990s, it went to 87, then it peaked at 376, but we're about 300 today. So that's, that's another indication, if you will. Since 1979, productivity has grown about 8 times faster than, and one of the things here is that labor has lost its share of income relative to capital income. Another way we look at income is from the Census Bureau. There's, in March of every year, 75,000 American households get surveyed. And this particular definition of income just looks at money income. And so you'll see the 20th percentile, we rank households from top to bottom in terms of income. I don't think this one's adjusted for family size. But you'll see that 20th percentile has basically stayed even from the late 1970s to now. The 95th percentile has had about a 60% increase in their income. But again, the 95th percentile has done very well, but our income inequality is really about the top 1% or the top 1/2 of 1%. Then CBO probably has done the best job since 1979 of putting IRS data along with census data. And you can see, and they also look at a more comprehensive definition of income. So they will include your health benefits, your pension benefits. They will look at an expanded definition of income. And the point there, again, it's a different measurement, but between 79 and 2007, the top 1%, again, relative to 1979, their income grew by 300% or so. There before and after tax, you can see what the share of, the change in average income. I want to talk a little bit about average federal tax rates here. I mean, we do some redistribution, and I actually looked at this chart. It's from CBO, and I called a friend and I said, is it really right? How am I going to explain the fact that the middle 3 quintiles went from an average income of 20% down to 12%? Now, again, that's probably because that definition of income includes a lot of health care, and your firm, whoever you work for, health care has been growing a lot. But it's also true that we have lower tax rates for the middle. And you can see, depending upon who's in power, the top 1% varies a bit. I think we're about back to 33%, but that's not quite as high as we were in the late 1970s. Here's another way of looking at it. This looks at real median income by race, and whites, non-Hispanics do a lot better. But for the first time, and this doesn't, because I've gotten it broken out by whites here and Hispanic and black, if you look at every economic cycle, your income declines on average during a recession. And then you hope by the peak of the cycle, you're better off than you were before the cycle ended. So in 2007, we kind of peaked in 2000. You can see the gray bars there are unemployment periods. And so, for example, the Hispanics have not gotten back to where they were on average in 2000. And the same is true of blacks. And that's one of the things I think we need to be very concerned about in our economy. Should we really care of the fact that the 1% is getting a lot of income? I think we should care more, in some sense, about the fact that some groups aren't having their income rise, at least the median household. And here's another way of looking at it. This looks at male wages, and this has been going on for some time, so that you've got at the bottom here the 10th percentile, the 50th, and the 95th. The 95th have had wages go up significantly over that, roughly a 30-year period. But even the middle income male wage earner and the lower have basically been a little below water this whole time. Female wages by decile, again, the bottom has held basically constant over this period. Females at the 50th percentile have had some growth, and again, just like the males, females at the 95th percentile have done quite a bit better. So there is no doubt that income inequality is increasing. Now, wealth is even more concentrated than income. So here I'm looking at, and this survey is done, it's the survey of consumer finances done by the Fed, and it's done every 3 years. So the bottom 90% in terms of before tax incomes gets 53% of income. They get 25% of wealth. And the top 3% have 54% of wealth, and they have 31% of income. And there is another distribution of household wealth. So that bottom line there is the top 1/10 of 1%. And they basically have now as much wealth here in 2012 as the bottom 90%. So again, wealth is distributed, and I don't think any economist would really dispute these numbers. I mean, these patterns are pretty well established. So what are the forces driving inequality? And I'm not going to go into an economics lecture here. The point of this slide is basically to say it's a function of a whole bunch of things. Technology, globalization, loss of manufacturing employment, absence of full employment for a good part of the time, the decline in unions, I think is a loss of negotiating power by labor, erosion of labor standards, both minimum wage and misclassification, et cetera. And we can come back to that if you wish. So why should we care? Why should we care about income inequality? Go back to my Rawlsian theory here. You can argue it's a little bit unfair. You go back to Plato. He associated economic inequality with ineffective citizenship. The rich become lazy, inattentive to their responsibilities, and the poor lack the resources to succeed. Hobbes stated that the extremely prosperous can employ their resources to undermine sovereign authority, and Rosé believed that the wealthy are in a position to shape the laws to serve their own interest at the expense of the poor. Now, I would say a modern day version of that was the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, where we have a principle, one man, one vote. But again, if I'm a very wealthy man and I can give lots of campaign donations in secret to some candidate, and I don't have to, no one knows that it's Wendell Primus giving that money, I think it distorts our political system. Now, and I've had some arguments with my Republican friends about this. I said, well, someday you're going to come back and rue the day that you are now applauding Citizens United, because it kept some candidates. One of the things of, if you're a political candidate, can you raise money from everybody to support your candidacy? If you get it all from one individual, how fair is that? Anyway, I'm just trying to make you think a little bit out there. So I think the main thing I would argue, I think most of us would agree we want equal opportunity for our children now. The question is, how do we, is a kid that's born in the southeast of DC that goes to a different quality of school than Fairfax County, et cetera, how good a chance does that individual, ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant, have to succeed? We have place segregation, we have unequal access to high quality schools. There's some literature that suggests extreme income inequality slows economic growth. We have maybe government then becoming largely responsive to lower income families, et cetera. So what can we do about this? How am I doing on time? Are you?
We've got about another 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. That's being generous, I think, but thank you. So what can we do if you agree that this is a problem? I think we can raise the minimum wage. We could put a more progressive tax structure and put a surtax on high incomes to finance public investments in clean energy, infrastructure, and education, and keep our promises to the elderly. I can come back to that. I think we need to maintain full employment. Comprehensive immigration reform, I'm going to delve into that. I think about it. The baby boom generation is about to retire. We are going to need more laborers supporting those of us who are over 65. Now is not the time to force 11 million people, and that is an impossibility, out of the country, because we're going to need them. They've been here for a long time, and that's obviously a big bone of contention between the R's and the D's. I think if the Senate bill that passed, with Marco Rubio, I think, in favor of it, at least at that time. And so it was a bipartisan bill. There have been estimates made that would increase our income collectively by 3.3% over about a 20-year period. It would actually raise incomes, and it would give $1 trillion over the next 20 years to the U.S. Treasury. Policies to boost labor force participation. What I'm talking about there is more high-quality child care, perhaps partially subsidized by the government. Deficit reduction. I think we ought to be engaging in deficit reduction. The economist rule is, as long as you have deficits under 3% of GDP, our federal debt as a proportion of our GDP doesn't rise. So I don't think we have to go all the way back to balanced budgets, but we clearly, again, if you look at the CBO projections, we need to do deficit reduction. Again, and I talked about it last time, and the promises we've made to the elderly in the form of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So that's an important business tax reform. And I think probably the most important thing to do in terms of income inequality is education policy. So right now, and I must admit, I put Republicans on the last column there. I understand the House Republicans very well. I mean, I've been working with Nancy Pelosi on the Hill the last 11 years. But I do not know where Mr. Trump is on all this. And in fact, I had an aside with some of the the Speaker's policy staff, and I said, Trump may be closer to where I'm at on Social Security policy than where you're at. But I think, he has said he's for a minimum wage increase, but let the states do it. So you see that there's a huge gulf. Comprehensive immigration reform, taxes on the wealthy. Is climate change real or not? Infrastructure spending. I mean, Democrats think we need massive doses here to relieve congestion, improve labor productivity, save energy, et cetera. So here's what was in the president's plan, and I think Hillary's platform is about the same. Preschool for all, more investment in Head Start, putting students on a path to college and careers. You can read that, but I think that is a key part of reducing income inequality. And the last, I'm going to go one there, comprehensive immigration reform, secure our borders, and the main thing we can do there is make sure that employers don't hire undocumented and earn a path to citizenship. That means pay fines. I'm just kind of describing the Senate bill. Protect our workers, unite our families. Right now, if we deported those 11, we are breaking up families because a lot of those children are U.S. citizens. So with that, I'm going to go back. My conclusion is income inequality is increasing. The biggest problem is we need to increase middle-class wages. We should and can reduce poverty. We need to maintain full employment. And those other three things you can read for yourself. So, thank you.
Todd Solmeyer, if you'd come forward and
Well, I'm going to sit
You're
from
just
here.
gonna sit?
It's been a long day, so
I'll
it's,
join you.
So the question, why am I here? Because he did a great job, obviously, the last time, so he got invited back. And as my son would probably say, I'm here because he got all the way down to S. right? That's why I'm here. Right? So, A through R said no, probably. So, so my background is mostly in business, and I have been very, very blessed to work with some great businesses and start my own business as an entrepreneur. Which if you've done that before, you understand the exhilarating feeling, but also the interesting feelings you have when you're the first or second employee and you have the privilege of building a business that ends up with several thousand people. And I always viewed business as an incredible stewardship opportunity because if you're fortunate enough to build a significant business with significant employment, you think about the impact that employment has on real people that can pay college educations and mortgages and things like that. So I have been mostly on the business side. I am, because I'm a business person, I think I've been involved in public policy and politics. One of the things that's very different between politics and business is that in politics, some people can make an entire successful career on getting to know, right? I get to know. I don't have to get to yes, I can get to know. I mean, people, outliers on both parties, if they're successful in getting to know, they can be very successful politically. In business, the ultimate game is getting to yes, because we've got to get to yes. Otherwise, if we don't get to yes, we don't build another product, we don't negotiate a joint venture. So I tend to see the world in a lot less black and white and a lot more gray. And that's probably just because of my background as a business person. So I put that in context. I did because of a couple, I like excursions outside of your comfort zone. So I had a couple excursions outside of business. I had the privilege of serving as CEO of really the country's largest business association, the National Federation of Independent Business. And had a remarkable experience, kind of that getting to yes. Business organizations tend to be right of center. But Bill Novelli, who ran AARP, and Andy Stern, who ran the largest union in the country, SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, organizations that would tend to be left of center, decided to partner with myself as CEO of a business organization and John Castellani, who ran the Business Roundtable, really represented the 50 largest companies in the United States. And the four of us came together under a coalition called Divided We Fail. And we meant it. And our view was if we could have a civil conversation, and our focus was on the long-term financial security of the country and healthcare reform. And this was in the 2006, 2007, 2008 timeframe. And we thought if we could travel the country together, knowing that we had different points of view on many issues, but engage in civil conversation and see where we could find common ground, that it was worthwhile as an experience. And that's probably the thing I was most proud of, because we actually did get to agreement on a number of different areas. And I think the interesting thing, we became very, very good friends, even though we had very different points of view. And I think if you asked each of us, we would say we learned a lot from one another, because we probably did a lot more listening to one another than actually talking past one another. And I think a lot more of that has to happen with the United States of America. So when people ask me what I am, I say I'm an American first, politics is second. And I believe that very, very strongly. So with that as background, I'll just talk about a few issues, just kind of run through very, very quickly, just with some thoughts. Just kind of a precursor, there are lots of tough issues out there. And I think a lot of these issues are interrelated. I think they're big issues. These are a lot of things that Wendell talked about. These are long-term challenges that we face as a country that take thoughtful, long-term solutions. I think people that try to sell you on quick fixes or things that can happen like that and the problem's fixed, I think they're being intellectually dishonest, both left and right, because I think some of these problems are tough problems. And it's going to take smart, committed people who put America first, I think, to come up with some of the right solutions. So with that just as background, in terms of the economy, economic growth, and income inequality, I'm going to, just from a private sector standpoint, we really care about three things. We care about talent, we care about capital, and we care about public policy predictability. You can't create economic growth and jobs without talent. And so talent, making sure that we have workers that are prepared and workers that are very adaptable in an economy that's changing more rapidly today than probably it ever has in the history of the United States. If you're familiar with Gordon Moore, who started Intel, he had something called Moore's Law about how quickly technology changes. Well, I would suggest we're seeing economic changes just as quick, and that has a real impact in terms of workforce and the skills and the talent that we need in order to be successful. The second is capital. I mean, obviously you need capital to build an enterprise, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also public policy predictability. You'll hear business people say that they'll take bad public policy as long as it's predictable over unpredictability. Because I think that's right, because I think we in the business community, we can adapt to a lot of public policy, but having consistency and predictability of public policy is something that's very, very important. You know, in terms of some big issues, I agree with when you come to income inequality, I don't think there's any more important issue than education. Because I think the smart people, economists like Wendell, will tell you that there's a direct correlation, almost a one-to-one correlation between educational achievement and lifetime economics. And that starts with K through 12 education. I do think we need to invest more. I think we need to stop making comparisons between how Fairfax County is doing with other counties in Virginia or other states. I think our comparisons have to be global, because our competition is global. So I think whenever we talk about education and making investments and looking at outcomes to make sure we get results and we can prepare young men and women to be successful in a very, very dynamic global economy, that we need to look at global comparisons and stop saying, well, Fairfax County is better than Petersburg, or Fairfax County is better than Virginia Beach. I said in a speech a few weeks ago, I don't think the quality of somebody's education should be because of where they live. I'm not going to get into all sorts of how you would do that from a policy statement, but young kids, young children shouldn't be penalized by where their parents live and where they go to school. And so I think we have to be thoughtful to ensure that every child has access to a quality education, because I do think it all starts with education. Technology and innovation. As I said, we're in a technologically driven economy. When you think of Walmart, you think of retail. But I would argue that Walmart is probably, other than the federal government, the largest integrated supply chain company in the world that uses technology, RFID technology, logistics technology to run their core business. I used to joke, I actually know the CEO of Walmart, and I say, you're really an integrated supply chain company that does retail on the side, because technology really is the backbone. Now, there are lots of positives with technology. Higher quality of life, transportation, personal conveniences, communications, life-saving procedures. I'm in the healthcare business today. Technology has been really, really good, right, in terms of all the things we can do today that we couldn't do 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's also highly disruptive. And technology, particularly substituting machines for people, there's a downside. Jobs and loss of jobs. Leads to lower price goods for consumers, but the economy that has changed so rapidly, that has clearly led to job displacement. So I think, again, focus on education, K through 12, making sure students, my wife's actually a counselor in a school, if a kid comes to school and hasn't had breakfast, they're not going to learn. So we've got to make sure that kids come to school, they're ready to learn, they can be successful, they can get through an outstanding K through 12 education, and then have education beyond K through 12. The Economist wrote a great piece about 4 or 5 months ago, and they talked about the blue-collar economy of 1980 that to a large extent doesn't exist today. And there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons they really talked about was technological change, rapid increases in productivity and jobs being eliminated. So that's a structural change in the economy. And I think the long-term fix has got to be education, the quality of education, constant learning, constant training, constant retraining. So if I were king for a day or president for a day, I would invest a lot of money in those areas. Infrastructure. I'm actually one of those Republicans. It was Eisenhower, by the way, who built the interstate highway system. A Republican. We wouldn't have an interstate highway system today without the leadership of Dwight Eisenhower. I think investment in infrastructure, you got to make that investment. Why? Because our infrastructure in the United States is crumbling. You can't have commerce, you can't have businesses, you can't create jobs without making investment in infrastructure. Who else raised taxes for infrastructure investments? Ronald Reagan, as President of the United States of America, raised the gas tax or supported a gas tax increase. So I think that's why, if you're going to talk about tax increases, making investments, sound investments to help the economy grow, to create jobs with those investments, and then obviously indirect jobs as well that comes out of it. I think that's very important. Other issues, income inequality and taxation. The typical fight is about higher tax rates or lower tax rates. I think we need to change the conversation. There was a great opportunity. I'll give you two misses in my humble opinion. President Bush, I think, had a huge miss after 9/11 because we were at a point right after 9/11 where I think if we'd asked the country to go big on anything, I think the country would have gone big. And we didn't take advantage of that opportunity. If you recall, one of the famous statements he had was, keep shopping at the malls. And I think that was actually time to go big. We could have gone big on energy. We could have gone big on a lot of things. I think President Obama had a big miss too. His big miss to me, something not known as well, was something called the Bowles-Simpson Commission. And Erskine Bowles, who was chief of staff to, I think, President Clinton from North Carolina, Alan Simpson from Wyoming, they formed a commission to come up with recommendations to help grow the economy, to deal with the national debt and deficits. And they had three options. And I think any of the three options would have been good options, fundamentally around tax rates, around investment, around savings, and depending on which option, you would eliminate deductions and credits. Wealthy people take advantage of deductions more than anybody else, so you can argue about progressivity and fairness. I think there was a great opportunity. Unfortunately, I think the president, it was his commission. Andy Stern, my friend from SEIU, was actually on the commission. And I think there would have been opportunities to maybe change the debate. I'm not blaming the president. There are lots of people to blame that we didn't move that. But I think that was probably some of the best policy work that was done recently to really focus on simplification, fairness, elimination of credits. We have a complicated tax system today, right? It's extraordinarily complicated. I couldn't do my taxes today if my life depended on it. I actually have a financial background. So I think that was a great effort and something we should take a look at again. Deficits and debt. It's a real concern. I mean, it's a real concern, not just for historic economic reasons, but from a capital standpoint. I mean, think about discretionary spending. Interest rates today are at historic low levels. When interest rates rise, we will pay much more on the debt. When we pay much more on our debt, we have less discretionary spending to invest in roads and things like that. Also, from a business standpoint, when rates rise and you have a competition for capital, you can get a crowding out of capital, which can also put pressure in the private sector in terms of availability of capital and the price of that capital. And businesses need capital in order to be successful. Trade, a lot of conversation about trade. I think fundamentally it's positive for the United States. It creates markets, it creates opportunities, but it also can have near-term dislocations. And I think those are real issues that we've got to take a look at. It's interesting because Republican candidate Trump likes to talk about all the bad trade agreements we've negotiated with China. As you actually know, we don't have a trade agreement with China. Actually, that's through the World Trade Organization. We don't have a bilateral trade agreement, which I think is an interesting commentary. Immigration, I would agree with Wendell. I think immigration has been a great friend to the United States in the history of our country. We all came here from someplace. And, I understand the necessity for securing borders. I think we have a right to know who's in our country. But one of the concerns, one of the things that immigration has done, if you look at Europe, Europe now has, most countries, negative birth rates. And as he said, when you have negative birth rates, what happens when you have negative birth rates? You actually don't have enough people being born to become workers to actually pay for older people. Germany, negative birth rate, but Germany's been a great manufacturing economy, high productivity. They've been really the success of Europe. Immigration has always done two things, I think, for this country. I think one, it's made us the great melting pot that we are, and I think it's brought really is the kind of the social fabric of our country. Secondly, from an economic standpoint, I think the advantages have been very, very significant. So I actually feel very strongly that we have to do things around the borders, absolutely. We should know who is in our country. But for the 11 million people who are here today, I think we should find a way to a path for legal status with whatever appropriate things we want to associate with that. I think that's the right thing to do. I think the idea that we're going to deport 11 million people is nothing short of insanity. And think about the social fabric, for our country. The last thing I would say, just generally, is we got to change the conversation in this country. I think we're in a language trap where we spend a lot of time talking past one another. I love hearing young people that are enthusiastically conservative or enthusiastically liberal, and I say to my liberal friends, do me a favor, get off of CNBC and go watch Fox. And I say to my conservative friends, get off of Fox and go watch CNBC. Because if you're so certain about your point of view, you shouldn't be afraid to have that point of view tested, right? Because if you get out of the echo chamber, Don't live inside the echo chamber, because only two good things can happen when you get outside the echo chamber. You might learn something which could actually modify your point of view, which is good. That's healthy. Or it just may reinforce your point of view, but at least you've given your point of view to have the opportunity to be tested. And I think a lot more of that has to happen, because I think we're talking past each other as a country. I understand politics, R's and D's, and conservatives and liberals, and somewhere in the middle of the road. But I'll tell you a quick story. One of my dad's best friends was a guy named Gale McGee. And Senator McGee was a Democrat from Wyoming, believe it or not, served in the Senate from 1958 to 1976. And when Senator McGee retired, my dad would invite me to have lunch with Senator McGee up in the Senate dining room, which was always a delightful thing to do. I was a young guy, I loved to listen to him. Senator McGee was a Democrat. He was considered a liberal, but only because of things like civil rights, which aren't particularly liberal, but if you think about the 1960s, did not support the Vietnam War. But I asked Senator McGee, I said, Senator McGee, who was your best friend in the United States Senate? He's a Democrat from Wyoming. Bam, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, conservative icon. I said, Senator McGee, how did Barry Goldwater become your best friend? He said, well, two things. He said, one, we're Americans first. And he said, we both served our country in combat in World War II. And we had that commonality. He said, I had a very different point of view than Senator Goldwater in terms of the future of the country. We disagreed on some big issues, and we would go to the Senate floor and we would have our disagreements. But we decided that we're Americans first, and that was first and foremost, and that while the debates were sometimes energetic, that at the end of the day, we were still Americans. And we both cared very, very deeply about the country. And what disappoints me the most in today's political discourse is conservatives questioning whether or not how much you love your country, or how much you love your country, or liberals doing the same thing to other people. That's not the right debate. We got big challenges, we got big problems as a country we have to face, but I'm also one of the people that absolutely believe that the United States of America still is a great country. Not to make America great again, but America is still a great country. And I would just encourage all of us as we go forward to probably do a lot more listening, a lot less talking. Strongly held views, I think, make the country great, and that's terrific. But we got big challenges, and I think we need to focus on how we get to ways to yes as much as we can, recognizing that in a Republican form of government, the art of politics is finding ways to get to yes and to compromise. The alternative is an autocratic form of government or dictatorship where you may get all that you want, but not exactly the type of form of government that I think any of us want as Americans. So, thanks.
So do you all want to take a minute? Is there anything that you want to reply to that the others said?
I would just say three quick things. I quibble a little bit with K through 12. Actually, again, I'm not an expert on this part of the literature, but a lot of child's ability is already predetermined at 5. And so I think we've also got to be, and there's not too many policy levers. I know someone by the name of David Oles that did a lot of work with home visiting programs. And, one of the things we as parents, sometimes we don't have an instruction manual on, what that means. And it's one of our most important functions as human beings, being fathers and mothers. And so, again, home visiting programs did a lot to help. Again, these were low-income mothers, these were nurses, in terms of proper nutrition, in terms of discipline and things like that. And again, it was a very comprehensive study. It showed that made a difference in those kids' lives, control group, experimental group, et cetera. But that's a small quibble. The only other thing I would say is we've kind of done both. We haven't done the tax raising part of, and there's one chart here. Oops, I've gone the wrong way here. We have cut discretionary spending, there's the chart, to its lowest levels, to Eisenhower levels. And I would argue we have done both. There's no reason Todd shouldn't he's running a business. He's not watching policy up on the hill every day. So we have done the spending part, spending reductions. We cut Medicare as part of the ACA quite a bit, at least the cost growth. So and then I guess the real question is taxes. I think we need taxes to finance, and we agreed on infrastructure. I think we need to do something about more education, et cetera, and that's going to take revenue. And yes, as an economist, I understand the bad effects taxes do in terms of marginal rates, et cetera, but the real issue is financing government and making a collective decision about public investments like infrastructure, like clean energy, et cetera.
Yeah, the only thing I would say on Bowles-Simpson is there was the spending part, but the tax part was arguably very different than part of the conversation you hear today, because all three options had a reduction in marginal rates, long-term incentives around investment, and very importantly, in return for reducing marginal rates, I mean, basically, as you know, a cleaning up of the tax code in terms of, it would wipe out, it may not be for this, but it would wipe out most of the commonly used deductions today, whether it's state income tax deductions, whether it's charitable deductions, mortgage deduction. I mean, they had three different options, but part of it was really focused on, as you know, simplification. Not just how do you generate more revenue, but how do you generate more revenue with a much more simple tax code. And with wealthy people, obviously, if you have a higher effective tax rate, you're taking advantage of deductions more than people who either don't itemize or have a much lower tax rate. So the reason I like that is not only get after the spending side, but I think it really focused on simplification. And I do think that we do need simplification. The last big tax reform we had was in 1986. It's been a long time. You can argue whether or not that really simplified the tax code in 1986 or not. But it's a very, very complicated system. I think that you want the tax code, as Wendell said, to be able to provide for core government services, absolutely. And I think you also want to have a tax code in place that encourages long-term investment, emphasis on long-term investment, not short-term flipping types of investment, but long-term investment as well as savings. And on the education thing, I agree. I mean, I would have no quibble. I mean, it starts early. Pre-K, I mean, you got kids that pull out these fun little devices. Here, his device. All right, 2, 3 years old, they're playing with these. So I don't think there's any greater investment that we could make as a country than in education. Now, education with results, we want to get results, but education, because again, and he's the economist, I'm not, but every piece of data I have seen, it has the strongest correlation to economic success, is education.
Todd's also the chair of the Board of Regents at William & Mary, so there is a bias there. And frankly, after you said remove charitable deductions, I didn't hear anything after that. Which tells me it's really interesting, isn't it, when you hear people talk about the economy. I always like the parts that don't affect me. The parts that I think affect other people. But even in that, I think is it's just interesting how that one statement, as soon as Todd said it, I was like, whoa, I remember that. Those were uncertain times. So the first question that I've got, and you all may have questions that you want to put on your note cards, and when you write them down, just hold them up. And we've got 2 folks in the back row that are actively watching for those, and will help you with them. The first question is about tax cuts. And so when both of you were talking about that, I thought it would be good to start here. Is there any evidence that tax cuts lead to increases in economic growth or economic activity?
Yes and no. When we're in a recession, as we were in 2009, tax cut made sense because we needed to stimulate aggregate demand. But one could also argue we could have spent and done other things. But when you're in a recession and the economy is well below full employment, then tax cuts or spending make sense. In a general proposition, you can't cut taxes and get to a balanced budget. I mean, that does not work. I think the first question we have to make is, what do we want to collectively pay for, buy, et cetera, and then have the tax system try to get as low a tax rate as possible. But I would more worry about those investments we need to make as opposed to worrying about the tax code.
Yeah, I think, like anything, everything's in context. So I'm not going to get into the details on the economic side, but I think there's always context. And so our competition is global. So I think you have to take a look at tax rates in other countries where you compete. I think states, there's some states that are very, very high tax states. Other states are low tax states. I think it also depends on where you start from. When marginal rates were 90% or 70% a long time ago, you can have an argument about additional tax cuts and such. I think it also needs to be targeted. I think that you can do some things that are very targeted that can actually spurn some economic growth and around clusters and creation, again, targeted types of tax credits or tax cuts. I do believe, and I believe pretty strongly in this, that probably the most important thing to me on the tax side is how do you encourage investment? And again, not flipping type of investment. I think there have been some pretty interesting ideas around capital gains, that the longer you hold an asset, if you hold an asset and if you flip the asset, you're going to pay a very high tax rate. But if you hold an asset for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, that you might have some type of descending tax rate for making that investment a long-term investment, as opposed to flipping it and making a good long-term investment. So I think there's some interesting thoughts and ideas that could better reward long-term investment that we ought to take a look at.
Just one other quick thing. One of the reasons our tax code is so complicated is because we have a lot of spending in the tax code. There are a lot
tax
of
expenditures, sure.
Tax expenditure, and what I mean by that is, all the windmills that are going up in Iowa have gotten a tax advantage, wind energy, solar energy, and that's also because of oil and gas. So, there is a lot of quote-unquote spending in the tax code because we have incentivized certain economic activities, and, there's some debate about, how level a playing field we have with respect to some of these tax expenditures, et cetera.
Yeah, as a general proposition, I'd stay away from specific as much as possible and really focus on how do you incentivize long-term investment and reward it.
So, Wendell, earlier you spoke about the income inequality that's that's a good church term, concentrated ever more wealth in the top 1% of the population. What, if anything, should be done to level the playing field and restore a shrinking middle class? So, in other words, the charts show what we've seen in other places. But what do we do? And I actually have another question here. In a capitalist society, why should we be concerned about income inequality? In other words, is that not just a fair outcome of a capitalist system? Might be a different way to say that.
Well, I tried to answer that, and I think, I don't think we have equal opportunity. Go back to my 4 million kids being born in this country. I would debate until long hours to say whether children that are born across this country, et cetera, and I don't think government can equalize everything either, but I think government can be doing a lot more to make sure that no matter where a child is born, no matter to what kind of parents, that child, again, has an opportunity to fulfill all of its God-given abilities. Now, also, there's sin in the world, and, we all make mistakes, teenagers make mistakes, et cetera, and that goes to criminal justice issues, et cetera. But I think we've, again, education, I think, and I would do a surtax on some of the millionaires to finance some of these things I think we need to do to finance education, et cetera. So I'm calling basically for more public investment. And I think those are things that will raise the wages. Donald Trump says, make America great again. The real issue is, how we do that. And I looked at the campaign websites, et cetera. It's not easy. It is not easy about how we grow those middle class wage rates. And I think that's what we need to be about.
So both of you have used the phrase investment, government investment, and infrastructure or other things. What's the difference between big government and the perception that big government doesn't manage money well, and the need for public investment that leads to good outcomes, whether it be infrastructure that serves the business community or education investment that serves the long-term health of our employment sector.
Yeah, I think the holder probably where you said, I don't know. I think that's a challenge because I think that, I mean, you're going to get very different points of view depending on what people say about what their definition of big government is and such. One of the challenges with Congress, and this is the imperfect nature of when you have a republic the way we have, is that when we say, for example, we're doing infrastructure bills, there's a lot of infrastructure in there, but just like Wendell said about the tax code, you have tax expenditures. One of the favorite terms I have on Capitol Hill is, kind of ornamenting up the Christmas tree. A lot of other stuff gets attached, if you will, and I think that's where you get some frustration. So I think, I believe, and I don't know the American people, but I think there's a strong case to be made for infrastructure investment, core investment in infrastructure, which I think we can readily define. We know what that is. We know it's transportation infrastructure and educational infrastructure, where I think you could get some consensus. And again, I mean, you look at Eisenhower, Republican, built the interstate highway system. Reagan signed gas tax increases to build up the Federal Highway Trust Fund for infrastructure improvements. I think part of it is, and I'm not a politician, but I think kind of truth in advertising, whatever we say we're going to go do, we actually go do, and we don't do something else. And I think that's where you get some frustration from people. We did an infrastructure bill, and then stories start coming about what's actually in the bill. Yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure, but there's a lot of other stuff there too. And even if that stuff is small, what it does, it destroys some credibility. And I know this is politics, and it's hard when you're trying to get agreement and compromise and things like that. But I think I would certainly support significant investments in infrastructure because I think it's critical to have a successful, growing economy that creates jobs, and importantly, creates private sector jobs, because private sector jobs get taxed, right? And those tax revenues are what supports that government spending. And so we've got to ignite and reignite the private sector side of the economy. And, it's interesting to look, and he's the economist, so I'll defer to him, but historically when we've had deep recessions, we've also had sharp spikes going back up. And right now we're almost in a bathtub, almost a bathtub. I mean, the economic growth it's tepid. We haven't seen that sharp spike up, and I think there's one question to economists like Wendell, are we going to be in a sustained period where economic growth looks more like 2%? Then maybe 3%. Are we going, because we're a more mature economy, do we have historical averages that are coming down, so growth is going to be slower? Well, if growth is slower, that generates less in tax revenue, which generates less to invest.
So I'll answer that question with an example. If we took NIH, National Institutes of Health, back up to 2003 levels in terms of spending, we would be spending $6.5 billion more per year than we do today. That chart up there shows you, as a percent of GDP, what's happened to R&D. Now, this isn't government researchers. I mean, these are grants, a lot of them to colleges, universities. Todd was telling me before we started here, what he's doing today, and I would bet that a lot of the advances in cancer cures and personalized medicine had their start at the NIH. Mm-hmm. And so, I get lobbied a lot, and we talk about the valley of death, where you've had grants from the NIH, and then you've got to go out and raise capital money to have a startup to see whether that particular gene therapy, cell therapy, whether that startup company actually works. I think we've got to think about incubators, private-public investments to help those ideas move from the lab to the bedside, et cetera. So that's one example. And energy, more efficient cars, and I'll back up a slide. There's what's happened to crude oil. We have done pretty well in terms of lowering our dependence on imported oil, and some of that is, again, investments that are made. So Infrastructure, that's, I think, what we're talking about here. And I think the case is very large that we need this investment.
The other, I'd just add on, I'd agree, on the basic science side, in basic discovery, industry is going to do what they call translational research and translational discovery, but basic discovery has historically been paid for by government, investment by government. And think about some of the returns on that investment. I mean, why is Silicon Valley really here today? Well, there are lots of reasons, but the investment that the United States government made into the space program, which resulted in how do you put smaller and smaller electronics and chips that actually sit on a cone to allow you to put a rocket into space. Well, that had a lot to do with the development of Silicon Valley. The Human Genome Project, it took 13 years, 1990 to 2003. The government invested about $3 billion. You know the industry that's been created today? It's $1 trillion industry. And that's just the economic side. Think about the impact on the human condition. People living longer, more healthy, more productively, contributing to the economy. So on basic science, infrastructure, education, basic science, I mean, we're not investing enough. Basic science today, we invest a lot less, as he said, than we did before. But those are all areas where you get a significant return on investment. One of the things that concerns me, and this is just thinking as a layperson, is that when you invest in infrastructure using capital, using debt, businesses do that. I think you get a return. So using debt for that purposes. But when you're using debt for purposes of operating expenses, I mean, just think about that. Over a long term, that becomes problematic. I mean, using debt to invest, to build infrastructure, to make investments in basic discovery, to make investments in clean energy, big capital expenditures to support that, you get a significant return. But one of the challenges today, as you know, with our federal government, is we use debt to fund day-to-day operating expenses. And that debt keeps growing. And those charts he showed you right there, right? I mean, discretionary spending's gone down in a very low interest rate environment. If rates were to normalize, that's going to keep going south because that gets crowded out on interest payments that we have to pay on the debt.
So let me ask you one more question. We'll let the crowd ask you one more question about infrastructure. And by the way, the moderator always reserves the right to rephrase your question. And when I often do that, I'll take it out of a yes-no format into a broader response. In terms of jobs and infrastructure, how was the Recovery Act with its shovel-ready projects successful or unsuccessful? In what ways was it successful or unsuccessful?
I think it has. In my mind, it was successful. I think the evidence is clear. The question is whether I'm going here. Oops, wrong way.
Okay, raise your hand if you're amazed that he knows his slide deck that well. I mean, seriously, I've just been like, you can go back and forth. That's really stunning.
So here is, again, from Bureau of Labor Statistics and Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office was tasked after we passed the Economic Recovery Act. This was, I think, like in February of 2009. The President Obama took office like in January 20th or so forth. And within 30 days, we had an $800 billion bill on the president's desk to sign. And so actually yours truly commissioned Ellen Blinder and I'm blanking now, a senior moment, another economist to give us what the facts were. And so if you look at that dotted line there, that's the unemployment rate without IRA, the low estimate, and then with a high estimate. There is no doubt we would have gone up to almost 12% unemployment instead of peaking at 12. And there's what would have happened to GDP. We would have had much deeper cuts in GDP if it weren't for IRA. Now, I think with retrospect, it should have been bigger. And we had 3 T's at the time: timely, transitional, and temporary. And because this recession was pretty bad, and we did not get back up to, there's the chart. So there's looks at recession. At the start of the recession is 0. And in June, and you can see how far we dipped in terms of a percentage cut in payrolls. So this recession was deep, 6% loss in employment. And we didn't recover and get back up to the level before the job until 6 years out. And I would argue, and then we went into my leader, the speaker, became leader in within the election of 2010. We lost 63 Democratic seats. And then we had the austerity budget. And that austerity budget, I think, really hurt and prevented that curve from not going up faster and getting to full employment faster.
Todd, what do you think?
Well, I mean, look, President Obama was dealt a tough hand in January of 2009. The minute he put his right hand down and was president of the United States, I mean, the economy was in serious, difficult trouble. And I had the occasion in the fall of 2008 when I was at NFIB to actually spend a good deal of time with Secretary Paulson and Secretary of the Treasury and actually be with the President of the United States in a small meeting. And I remember going home to my wife, it was September of 2008, and I said, I was in a meeting with about 10 people with the President, and he looked really scared. I mean, that's how bad it was. I mean, you're talking about the credit markets collapsing, and so I think the President clearly made sense to make a major investment in infrastructure given where the economy was. I also applaud President Bush for TARP, something that a lot of people get hammered on today as a, quote, bailout of the big banks. But when things are moving as quickly as things were moving and the uncertainty, and Hank Paulson's a smart guy, a lot of others, not Greenspan, but Ben Bernanke, a very smart person too. You had some very smart people come together and say, look, we don't really understand where the credit markets are going, but if the credit markets were to collapse, what some people thought they could have collapsed, that recession would have been a lot deeper. And so, one of the challenges in politics today is when you say the word TARP, everybody says big bang. This is the Troubled Asset Relief Program, basically to recapitalize the balance sheets of American banks that were undercapitalized because of the deep, financial crisis in the fall of 2008. But a question for you, did the American taxpayer make or lose money off of TARP?
We actually gained money.
You made money. That's exactly right. So here was a call that was made in the fall of 2008. The American taxpayer actually made money by a decision was made to try to stabilize the banking system. I think President Bush made the right call, and I think when President Obama became president, given the state of the economy, which was still very, very weak in 2009, I think investment was appropriate. Now, the level of investment, I leave that to smart people like Wendell.
But just to indicate how bad this recession was, that chart there shows you long-term unemployment. So these are people who are unemployed 6 months or longer. And in terms of the rate, which is on the left-hand axis, or the share, you can see the shaded bars again are recessions. You can see how often we have recessions there. Look at the last recession that occurred in 2010, 29. I mean, that is a huge spike. And with that, comes a lot of human suffering. And, unemployment comp, we extended. We did various other things to make sure that, again, states have to run balanced budgets. So we gave huge Medicaid infusions of funds so states could take that money and spend it on teachers and other things. But in retrospect, I think we could have done more. But clearly what we did helped. There's no doubt, but it is also controversial. I mean, I think if you polled the American public, they would not agree with yours truly on this. And
or TARP, they wouldn't agree on TARP.
Yeah, that's right. And so, there's some question here of how good our messaging team was in terms of trying to explain what we were doing and why we were doing it, et cetera.
So you just alluded to state budgets having to be balanced, which is a nice segue to the next question. In your opinion, what's the most important step to reducing the federal budget? And in general, what's your thought about national debt? Too high, too significant? What do you think about that?
Well, I'm concerned from a debt standpoint because rates, look at rates right now. Rates are artificially low right now. And at some point when rates start moving, and they have to move at some point, the interest payments that we pay on the debt will increase, and that has a crowding out effect in terms of discretionary spending. So you think if you don't like discretionary spending now, there's going to be less of it, right? If rates are 5%, 6%, 7% versus where they are today, or 4% even. And that's a big change. We're getting close to 20 trillion, 19 trillion. I don't think we're having a serious conversation as a country, and that's, I'm not saying that as a Republican or anything else. I don't think the conversations are serious. I think that we've got to have those serious conversations. There are clearly investments we have to make as a country. We've talked about a lot of those investments, but just as any family has to think about wants and needs, I don't think we have that conversation as a country. And yeah, it concerns me when you see $19 trillion in debt. Yes, it concerns me that there are other obligations that are out there, no matter how worthy they are for different populations and people. Are we right now financially sound at $19 trillion in debt and growing? Does that concern me? Absolutely. Do I think we need to have a serious conversation about that? Absolutely. Does it involve, at this point, I mean, look, if the canvas were blank, would you increase taxes? If we had no debt, I would say no. But at $19 trillion, I think it's going to take some combination. You've heard the whole thing about grand bargain. We haven't got to quote a grand bargain, but I think it's going to take additional revenue to better invest, not only for things where we need to spend money, but I also think it's going to have to take some real hard reexamination of where we spend our money. And that's a lot easier said than done, because when we talked about the Bull Simpson about different options, when you say, well, you know what, I'm all in favor of tax simplification until it takes away the mortgage deduction, until it takes away the charitable tax deduction and things like that. But I don't think right now we're having a serious conversation in this country about our national debt, and I think we need to have that.
I guess I would say that the budgets that President Obama has put forward the last few years, we have tried to engage the Republicans in these serious discussions. And there is no willingness on the part of the other party to engage at all at this point in raising taxes. Grover Norquist, I would argue, a lobbyist, every Republican has signed a pledge, no taxes increase. And I think taxes are going to have to increase because we've cut spending. So tonight, we've had some agreements on public investments, infrastructure and the like. That's going to cost money. In the president's budget, there was $300 billion over 10 years for infrastructure spending. We've talked about keeping our promises to the elderly, and that's going to require money. And we've also talked about deficit reduction. I'm for all three of those things. And I think those would help middle-class incomes grow. And I don't think we have to touch the charitable deduction. We may have to trim, and I think, when I look at income inequality, I think a good part of that can come from the very wealthy. I didn't say all. I think we should raise some of our energy cost or infrastructure cost in terms of a gasoline tax or a carbon tax of some kind. So I'm not asking for it all to come out of the top, but I think a good hunk of those three things that we need could be financed because of the great gains that have come at the very top of our income distribution.
Yeah. I mean, think about one thing, and this is just, I think it's a factual statement and this is not a commentary on either the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. So I want everybody to hear what I'm saying. This is not a commentary, but during that period of time, we were borrowing hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars from countries, including the Chinese, to fight, quote, wars of liberation in the Middle East. I mean, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition that we're actually borrowing money from the Chinese to finance our men and women in uniform who are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, I'm not making a commentary on the wars, but just the financial structure. To me, that great nations don't do that. And so I think we do have to get serious about the size of our debt. I've not run the United States of America, obviously, but I've run some pretty big organizations. And when people, come to you and say there's absolutely nothing we can cut in the organization in terms of, spending and things like that, it's not true. Now, is that going to completely solve the problem? Absolutely not. Do I think we're going to have to do something on the revenue side? Yeah, I do. I agree with Wendell on that. But I also think we can do things on the spending side. And it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily spend less, but you may spend it in different, better places, right? Because it's always about choices.
So the next question asked follows up on that perfectly. Instead of raising taxes, how can government be reduced and allocate these funds to things like education or infrastructure? So, we've been sort of joking about that, getting rid of the charitable deduction, portion of the income tax code. And of course, I know that members of Floris United Methodist Church wouldn't be affected by that one bit if that happened, which makes me very happy. But it is this thing. My observation is I hear a lot of people talking about reducing big government. So let me bring my own question in with this one. Often when people want to reduce big government, what that often translates into is reducing government programs that disproportionately benefit the poor. Rarely do I hear big government reduction discussed as reductions to, say, the defense contracting industry, which is very prevalent here in Northern Virginia. But both of those are examples of government expenditures. So back to this question, instead of raising taxes, how can government be reduced and the funds properly allocated? So from a political perspective, how on earth can that be done? Because what's of interest to that person is not of interest to this person. And so it's back to your original thing about all those children being born.
It's not easy,
depends
is
on
it?
what house they're in.
Again, I think the president has put forward policies that would reduce spending somewhat. I think, I've tried, and it's difficult, to try to cap drug expenditures, cap drug prices. But the president's budget gets about $200 billion out of reducing the return on drug spending. That's a budget cut. So there are some things, and right now I'm engaged in discussions about public health emergencies, the opioid crisis, the Zika virus, and Flint. And yes, we're going to probably pay for that by some minor cuts. So I'm not against doing some cutting of expenditures, but for the most part, my argument is that most of the cutting has already been done. And we need to really look at the tax side, et cetera. So there's some numbers right now. Taxes are 18.1% of GDP. Federal spending's at 21.4%. Federal debt's at about, again, 76%. We in this country, when you talk about the economy, we produce in this country about $18 trillion, trillion. And so, I think we need to raise those revenues about 2 percentage points of GDP over a period of time. And it can be done. It can be done. And economic growth will actually, in the long run, we would be better off, and our economic pie would expand, but there would be some pain associated with that.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, one of the things that we'd have less debt today, and it may be unpopular, that if you're king for a day, what I would have done it for two reasons. I think when we made the commitment to go to, again, I'm not commenting on the war itself, but we made the commitment to go to Iraq. I think that what the president should have done had a temporary tax increase. And I'll tell you why. Number one, because about $3 trillion, I think now we're in. I mean, it's a lot of money. We've committed a lot of money. And I don't think if you're going to commit the nation to war, men and women who serve so admirably, we should pay for it, number one, and we shouldn't pay for it borrowing money from the Chinese. Secondly, this is more personal, think about the period of time since 2003. We have asked so much of our men and women in uniform and their families. And for those of us who are not in uniform, me, we've asked basically nothing of me. So I think if you're going to commit a country to war, there's got to be some sense of shared sacrifice. And one of the ways to do that is to say we're going to pay for it as opposed to borrow money to pay for it. And I think that's the right economic thing to do, but I think also if we're going to commit the country to war, we should all be in some way. We may not serve in the uniform, but we all know in this room, we have friends that have done 5, 6, 7 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have families that are blown up, marriages that are blown up, people that have lifelong injuries, and yet we've asked so much of so few men and women in uniform and so little of so many, which I think is bad public policy.
So let me say this. Todd is not the Republican that I deal with on the Hill.
Well, I was a Lincoln Republican because, truthfully, I'll tell you why. Because I came to Virginia, and in Virginia, if you know the history of Virginia, it was the Democratic Party that was the party of segregation.
Yes.
That's how you become a Republican.
I mean, but the contrast right now between the two parties is just unbelievable. So the Republican budget that is still too liberal for some of the Tea Party, so that Ryan can't even bring it to the floor right now. Look at what it does to low-income children. It cuts spending by $6.5 trillion over the next 10 years. 62% of those cuts come from programs designed to combat poverty. There's an unprecedented $3.7 trillion, again, from programs that assist low income. The average program helping low-income families is cut 42%. I mean, now, I would also believe, that budget's not going anywhere. And I think you can argue about this blueprint. It's not the actual changes in the law that makes those cuts. But I guess it's hard for me to describe just how deep this gulf is. So there's no Republican on the Hill. Now, they may be saying it behind closed doors where Todd would be saying, oh, we think we can raise some taxes. That isn't happening right now. And on the campaign tour, I looked at the Trump campaign, he's talking about tax cuts. And then there's an argument about how much of it actually goes to the very top. I think, that is just, in my opinion, very bad policy. We cannot be talking about giving more revenue away when we're at kind of full employment. Now, 5%, maybe we can drive that a little bit lower, and there's a lot of variation in that by state. But now is not the time to be talking about more tax cuts.
Yeah.
So we're almost at time, and because people's brains after about an hour and 25 minutes hurt when they talk about the economy, is my experience. This is just sort of an interesting thing to watch the two of you, because as you just said, this is not your average conversation that we have about these things. So I'm going to take a question somebody wrote in. You two intelligent guys seem to agree broadly. Why can't Congress? And there's another statement here that might suggest that it has something to do with the intelligence of Congress that I will not read. Because back to that whole Christian discipline about question writing. But I would like to hear from each of you. And I know it takes us off the topic of the economy, but the truth is many of us fear that the economy is being dramatically impacted by government policy that is not being created due to the lack of conversation. And I'm wondering, what's your opinion, each of your opinion, on why is it that Congress simply can't do this work?
Well, I'll give you a thought, which I think is both in the House as well as at the statewide level too, and that is around redistricting. If you look back, if you remember Tom Davis, Congressman Davis, Tom's one of my very, very dear friends, and Tom is about as good a statistician. He can tell you who was on the Chicago Cubs starting lineup in 1964. He can also tell you every single piece of data about every congressional district in the United States. And what it'll show you maps, if you look back 30, 40 years ago, there are 435 seats in the House?
Yes.
435. The level of competition for those House seats 30, 40 years ago was a lot higher. And with the advent of the computer age and the ability to do very fanciful drawing of redistricting boundaries that protect incumbents generally, we have drawn districts, unfortunately, in my view, where the game in a Democratic district is the Democratic primary and the game in a Republican district is the Republican primary. So in that Republican district, it's going to be who's moving here to the right, and the Democratic district, it's who's moving here to the left. So the number of House districts that are actually competitive today is probably at a historically all-time low. I mean, the redistricting is done exceptionally well. It's down to the household, it's down to the neighborhood. They know your preferences, they know the magazines you read, they know the newspapers you read, they can figure out a lot of smart things, and so they're very good. Look in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the 100 members of the House of Delegates. There are probably 15 seats at best that are actually competitive today, where both parties have a shot at winning those. And my view is that if it's good to have parties with different ideas, because then you get a competition for ideas. But when the movement's all this way, because the game is inside the party as opposed to the ability to compete here, I think you lose some of those good ideas. So I think if you want to make some positive changes, I would think about changing the redistricting process, which is entirely a political process, to something, and some states have done this, where it's much more impartial, where you actually have commissions and things like that are set up to get districts that are much, much more competitive. And I think competitive politics produces much, much better ideas. And when you don't have to compete on ideas, I think people will get lazy, and I also think people move to the extremes. I think that's one of the reasons. The second thing I would do, and this goes back to the comment about you can't mandate this, but in the old days in Congress, people spent a lot more time in Washington than they did flying home. And he knows this. It's not uncommon for a member to fly home on Thursday and not be back until Tuesday. And it's hard to build, if you believe that in order to build trust, you first have to build familiarity and then build relationships. When you're spending the majority of your time not here with your colleagues and back in your home district doing, quote, constituent service, but also having to raise a lot of money, right? That's one of the things he talked about, money in politics. They got to raise a lot of money today. And so I don't think they build the relationships. I think also the 24/7 news cycle has had a lot to do with, politics. We're in this era of Twitter and all the things I've done in my technology businesses, but I don't think you get the type of analysis that you had historically looking at issues. I don't think people are as detailed and things like that. So that's just kind of generationally. But I think if you wanted to change the game and change and make it more competitive, I would focus on redistricting.
I think it's a lot of things. I won't disagree about the redistricting at all. What does that do? I mean, again, if you put a lot of one party into one district, there's not that congressman then represents those very conservative individuals. I think it is the money. I think it's the 24/7 news cycle. I think it's also some of the talk show radio, et cetera. And I mean, that's ultimately why I think forums are like this, because with my 40-year career on the Hill or around the Hill, I mean, I think at the end of it, informed voters is a key to making democracy work. And, I think you've got to demand, things we talked about last time, expanding Medicaid. I mean, you've got to take the time to become informed about the individual that you think should represent you. I have a lot of respect. I mean, the place, Capitol Hill, has changed enormously. When I first started working there in '75, there were lots of Republicans that I had lots of respect for. The Mark Hatfields, the Barbara Conables, the Bill Grattisons. Those names may not mean much to you, but those were respectable Republicans. Now, I do not. And I used to think I knew what made Republicans tick. That was part of your job. I mean, how do you reach a compromise? What is important to that person sitting across the aisle? And, I had the opportunity to do that last year with Mr. Boehner and his staff on negotiating an SGR fix. But, that's lost when they're not here. And, think about it, most of the time when they're on weekends, they're raising money, and lots of it, to say, I'm better, my ideas make more sense. And then they come here Tuesday to Thursday and then have to compromise with this person they tried to raise lots of bucks on. Now, I don't have a better way in terms of our democracy of ours, et cetera. But I think it is the money, it's the media, it's the gerrymandering or the thing Todd just talked about. But most of all, and I do think there's still some semblance of this, where we recognize there's a problem, and then you do something about it, but sometimes those problems, almost by definition, both involve political benefit as well as political pain. And, so raising taxes is political pain. No politician likes to say, I'm going to raise taxes. And, some of our problems right now mean that. I mean, again, keeping our promises to the elderly. So that makes, and then you want to jump off the cliff together, because then you can't have campaign ads run against you. So lots of times it's kind of strategically negotiating so both parties recognize that they're going to have to do some tough things, but they don't want to get the blame for that. And so that makes, most of the time I don't think the public cares what we do on Capitol Hill. I have sons and daughters that live far away from here. Do they follow what I do? No. Or even what Capitol Hill does. Do they recognize we have an opioid crisis or the Zika virus, or et cetera? Now, I presume that's starting to permeate, but there's not any simple solutions there either. But I'm rambling on, but I'm just saying right now politics has become very difficult, and until you have a common purpose to what you want to accomplish, it's just hard to get there. And especially then when you have some smart people that have said, okay, take gun violence. I think we should be doing something about gun violence, but immediately you run into the NRA and all that means.
So I think this has been a countercultural political conversation for America in 2016. And I really do. It's just really enjoyable hearing the two of you talk, finding points of agreement, some points of disagreement. It's frankly, I don't know about you, but I found it really refreshing. And so thank you. We're very, very appreciative.